Oh, David, hi. Hi, everyone. We're going to start with webinar for ECHO 201, Microeconomics. We're going to go over the requirements of the final project. For those of you who logged in for the first time this semester, my name is Kiara Yates, and I'm a macro and microeconomics instructor with Southern New Hampshire. David's asking he can hear with the headphones in or out. Maybe your headphones are not plugged in entirely. Sometimes you have to push them really in hard, but it is weird. So tonight we're going to go over the requirements of the final project for microeconomics, ECHO 201. You've worked on the 3 milestones. You have researched your firm. If you have not submitted all 3 milestones, I recommend that you submit the milestone before submitting the final so that you can get some feedback and you can add it to your final. The final is just a copy and paste of the 3 milestone one after the other. If you kept them separated and maybe wrote a brief introduction each milestone, then I would, just reword it and make sure that your thought flows throughout the final, that it doesn't look like 3 different assignments, since they're not, because the final will be one continuous research regarding your firm. For the final project, you have an additional category in the rubric, which is the category of exemplary. If you have not had a chance to look at the rubric for the final project, I recommend that you do go look at it. This way you can get an idea of it. I will, let me see if I have a copy of it that I can share. This way you can also see it. Here it is. So when you open the, oh, this is an old one, milestone 1. Looking for the, let me see if I can find the other one. Final project guide. Let me see if I have it loaded on Adobe. So the category of exemplary, here it is. The category of exemplary, as you can see, requires you to provide additional insight regarding your firm. So when we go to milestone 1, you've outlined the purpose of your paper and you have summarized the history of the firm. To be exemplary, in addition, you want to use industry-specific language to establish your expertise on the firm, right? Because you're acting as consultant. So you just want to be convincing in your introduction. And to be exemplary in the history, you want to make sure you chose a company that is well suited to the analysis. So when you're discussing the history of your company, say, for example, that you chose a company that only has 2 years of history, it's difficult to establish trends in the future, or it doesn't have, some features that will allow you to conduct the whole research for the final, then that might hinder your work and also mean that you're not getting the exemplary for the introduction. So in the introduction, in the history, you will also, just provide details on your company. This way, you know that it's suited for the analysis. Moving on to milestone 2. In milestone 2, you were researching the demand and supply trends, and you use the determinants of demand and supply to explain how demand trended. When we're talking of trends, we're always talking of a 5-year period. So to be exemplary in this category, you would explain in detail the reasons for the trend. So if your demand went up or went down or fluctuated through the 5 years, you want to make sure you explain why there was that fluctuation. It might have been caused by changes in market conditions. It might have been caused by changes in supply, caused by changes in the input of supplies. So you want to make sure that you explain why there was that 5-year, why the demand change fluctuated, went up, went down during your 5-year period. When we talk about demand and supply together, you want to provide concrete examples. So the conditions in the firm's action. So what is the firm, how did the firm react in terms of supplies to things that might have happened in their market? So if there was a change in the cost of the inputs of supply, for example, or in the case of Tesla, they changed the factory, they moved their factory somewhere else. So what you want to provide a good example of this element. If you could provide a concrete example, then you will be exemplary. In milestone 2, you also went over price elasticity of demand. First of all, you used the data available, and you would have used your demand trends if they were suitable for this analysis to justify how you determine the price elasticity of demand for your firm's product. So if you determine that it was price elastic, inelastic, fairly elastic, or inelastic, then you would have explained in this section how you reach this conclusion. In this, to be exemplary, you want to illustrate your claims. So you just want to go a step further and substantiate how you reach that conclusion. Just not say, well, demand increased when the prices decreased. And so you establish that. You want to be more specific. And when you illustrate the claim is like providing the concrete example. It's sort of the same thing. The other thing you did for price elasticity was analyze the factors, the determinants of price elasticity. If you didn't identify all the determinants of price elasticity in milestone 2, it was okay. You could have still be proficient. To be exemplary in the final, you will have to use all 5 determinants of price elasticity. So all the factors need to be examined. So the third element of price elasticity is the pricing decisions. In this case, you explained how the price elasticity of demand affected the firm's pricing decisions. In addition to that, you will have to you will have to illustrate the claims. You will have to provide examples. In this case, again, illustrate claims. You again want to provide concrete examples. Use the research. When it says use the research, you want to make sure you have suitable sources to support your claims. So every time you say uses research, you better make sure you cited your source, your reference, because you might have a source, you did the research, but if you don't cite your reference, your instructor doesn't know, and they cannot give you an exemplary. So very important to cite your references and your sources anytime they are needed. So this ends milestone 2. Milestone 3, you just did last week, and you should have all received feedback for it if you posted it on time. With milestone 3, you examine the costs of production and then the overall market of the firm, and then you provided recommendations. So in some ways, it was the longest milestone of the 3. For the cost of production, again, you examine the cost of production over time. And when we say over time, again, you analyze the cost of production over a 5-year period and how it impacted your firm's profitability. So you related your cost of productions to the revenue of your firm. If the costs increased and the revenue decreased, or did it remain the same? How could that possibly be? Why? What happened? So when you're doing this element, you want to make sure you provide concrete example to substantiate your claims. And when you're providing concrete examples, you are using a source, because you're not coming up with the example in your mind. You're using an example that is related to the firm. So you might find that example in the news. You might find it in their financial reports. In the commentary of it, they might mention some examples that are suitable for this element. So to be substantial, in the end, when you find your example, you will be citing the source you found that example from. The next element for the cost of production was the output decisions. You distinguished fixed costs from variable costs. You could have done the 2 elements together because the cost of productions are made of fixed costs and variable costs, but you also need to explain how the difference between variable and fixed costs informs the output decisions. Why is this important? It's because fixed costs do not change regardless of how much is produced, as compared to variable costs that change in relation to what is produced. And there will be a point in which the marginal revenue for the additional element product produced will not bring revenue anymore. So the firm will stop producing. So in this case, you want to make sure that you provide insight into how the firm can manage those costs. So you've met the proficient criteria, you just want to give an additional input. It's almost a brief recommendation. You don't want to go into too much detail because you have all your recommendations after. You just want to give a little bit of insight based on what you found on how the firm can manage those costs. If the costs, for example, are increasing and are affecting profitability and the output of the firm. Moving on to the other element you developed in milestone 3 is the market. So you first of all identified the market share for the firm. You should have found a pie or a graph or a table, anyway, data that told you what the percentage is. I know that some firms are more challenging to research because you cannot find a lot of past information on the market trends. I know some of the students that did Starbucks were having trouble. If you did Starbucks, there's a really neat report that is available online in PDF that goes at least to 2013. And then you can find market share for 2016 and 2017, which you can also look into the financial reports to figure out. So that gives you a little bit of a trend for Starbucks. To be exemplary when you get to the final, you want to present data graphically and over time, of course. So over time could be a challenge, but if you don't find the specific numbers, like the actual market share, but you are able to explain that the market share has improved and increased over time, or it has decreased because maybe there was a new entrant in the market, then that would already help you establish a trend over time. And if you cannot find a pie chart, you can produce a chart through Excel, for example. Or you could even draw one on a piece of paper and take a picture of it and transfer it into your final assignment, if that seems easier for you. Or you can use some free drawing in any app or software. I mean, it doesn't matter how you produce the graph as long as it's correct, and as long as you can add it into your final, because you need to present the data graphically. Another element of the market research was the barriers to entry. You analyze the barriers to entry into the market. Every market has different barriers to entry, and the barriers to entry are really also a determinant of establishing what type of market structure your firm is operating in. In this scenario, in this case, to be exemplary, you have to provide a successful example of an example of a successful or a failed entrant into the market. Oh, Rodney, hi. Yeah, my name is not Nicole, I'm actually Chiara. It sounds like a K sound. We just use Nicole's account to do the webinars. But the dotted graph, the graph that you can do for the market share, you can draw one if you want to on a piece of paper and then scan it or take a picture of it and add it to your final. It does not have to necessarily be produced like through Excel. If you can find one that's already made online, better. But if you cannot find one, you can make one. Oh, no worries. Moving back to the barriers to entry, you need to provide an example of a failure or a success to the entry in the market. Tesla is an example of success of entry in the market. Tesla's fairly new. They've entered the market and they, succeeded. Under Armour has been in the market for a while, because I think Under Armour started in the late 90s. So you would think it's almost 20 years that Under Armour is around. However, they're still a good example of a company that at some point entered the market and remained in the market successfully for sports apparel, because I don't think there was any others that entered and were successful after Under Armour. The examples of failed entrants, I can't quite think of some. Failed entrants are more common in the restoration industry. You might be able to find some. You know, maybe coffee shops that open and then closed could be an example, and they can be coffee shops at a local level. It doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, a big chain like Starbucks, because they are still a competition of Starbucks, even if on a smaller scale. So here, provide an example and you will be exemplary. The last element of the market was to establish the market structure. So after you have analyzed the market share and the barriers to entries, you were able to determine what type of market structure your firm operated in. It was a monopoly, oligopoly, monopolistic competition. Lululemon Athletica is new, isn't it? I think Lululemon is fairly new. So David, you might want to go look at it and see how successful they are. And if they actually, because doesn't Lululemon target a specific audience, like only women or something like that? If it's only women, it's not a true competitor in all the ranges, just in a specific range. But they could be an example of a new entrant if they entered the market recently and are fairly successful. Yes. They're doing men, so there you go. Yeah, that could be an example in the athletic department, sports apparel. So when you have identified your market structure, you can you need to provide specific example to demonstrate that that is the real market structure and the firm's influence. So you might want to find an example in the news. I don't know if you have Nike, for example, with you can find some information in the news that show how Nike dominates the market. The same you can do for Starbucks if you chose the specialty coffees. There will be examples that will show you that your firm is dominant or non-dominant in their market. I mean, Under Armour is very common in the market, but it doesn't dominate the market. It doesn't have a, you know, the highest percentage share in the market. However, it may have some influence in the market. Under Armour might come out with a new pair of shoes, and maybe Nike comes out with a new pair of shoes right away after, or something like that. If you find examples like that, you will be able to identify the influence of your firm in their market. This pretty much wraps up all the research you had to do, because for milestone 3, then you provided recommendations, and your recommendations would have been based on the research you did in milestone 1, 2, and 3. The first recommendation you provided was how the firm can manage future production, and you needed to integrate data in this recommendation to be proficient. To be exemplary, you want to integrate economic principles. So what have you had learned by studying your microeconomic book, Hubbard, that supports the recommendation you made? Basically, what economic principle supports the recommendation you made? In the second section of the recommendation, it doesn't really matter how short-term or long-term the recommendation is. Obviously, if it's a recommendation that is short-term and will have only a short-term life, in the sense that it will not improve the growth of the company, it's not a really useful recommendation. But if your recommendation is to be implemented short time to have a long-term reach, then it's a perfectly good recommendation. So you can use it. So for the recommended action, you had to suggest how the firm's position within the market and its competitors allows it to take the recommended action. So you provided an action about future actions that the firm should take. How can the firm take these actions considering the market structure it operates in? So here you will be talking about the market structure again. And so how can your market grow within your market? How can your firm grow within your market structure? How can Under Armour acquire more market share in its market structure in the oligopoly it operates in, for example? Yes, David, I'll answer your question when I'm finished the last element. This way we can go over it, everything. For the last element, how will your firm sustain its success? So again, here you're going to be evaluating the demand trends you looked at and the price elasticity, and give a recommendation on how it will sustain its success in the future. And again, you will be specific. You will want to provide a concrete example, so you give specific ideas of how the firm can sustain it. So you're not just in general going to say it's going to increase or decrease prices because the market trends show that the price elasticity is elastic, but you will provide an example and ideas. Specific ideas can be based on something you observed from the past that they can redo in the future, or it can be based on something you read in Hubbard, or some ideas, you know. So you just want to substantiate and support your recommendation. Going back to David's question, he said, for me, I have Tesla and I'm recommending selling lithium battery packs to other electric car manufacturers, but after their market shares plateau. So that could be a good recommendation, because it could expand Tesla's reach in other markets. So instead of just selling cars, it would sell batteries too. It can be dangerous, because I think one of Tesla's strongholds is their batteries. But I'm not proficient about the company enough to say that for sure. But that could be a good, that's a good recommendation. So in the second part, with the recommended action, you will be explaining basically how the market positioning of Tesla allows for their recommendation to be carried out, and how can it strengthen its position in the market. So if you can reach those conclusions for the recommendations, then that recommendation is valid, and you'll be able to be exemplary for the purpose of the final. The last and foremost, because it's got the same weight, or it doesn't have the same weight as the other elements, but it's still important to get a high grade if you want to, is the articulation of response. Make sure you apply APA formatting. You include a title page, you include running headers, proper spacing and size, and that you absolutely reference every source that you cite in the content. The reference list is a reflection of the citations. That's what it is. So if you have cited that source, it needs to be in the references, and vice versa. So make sure that all your references are cited correctly. I'm finished going over this rubric. So if anybody has any questions, we have a few minutes for questions before I have to move on to ECHO 202. So Kenny writes, I was locked. I researched on Amazon. I was able to do milestone 1 and 2, but milestone 2 is tough. Yes. So you picked Prime and ebook for a specific example. A lot more work. I had to cut back pages when I did milestone 3 alone. Question, I typed my paper in Word using APA. However, the professors let me know it comes out MLA. Why? It comes out MLA. Go check your Word settings and make sure, because Word has actually settings for APA, MLA, and all this. So you want to make sure that you have APA and that Word is not automatically making corrections to your paper, like when you include a citation or something. The other thing is, do not trust Word to correctly apply APA formatting, because it does not. I have students in the past who relied entirely on Word for the APA formatting, and it was always the citations were incorrect and the references were not formatted correctly. So do not rely on an automatic formatting tool that will tell you that it's APA. Do not include the website in the citations. You only include the last name and the year. If you don't have the last name, it will be the title of the paper, article, or website you found. Google Docs would be better to use. Honestly, it doesn't make a difference what you use. When you say that you're using APA, is that what you selected in Word? You told Word that you're using APA? If you did, it's okay, but then you need to go and verify that APA is actually applied correctly. Yeah, because Word doesn't apply APA correctly in all instances. I know for sure that it does not format correctly the citations. It gives you an incorrect citation that is not an APA standard citation. Yes, David, exactly. It is better to do the APA format manually. And you can go in the Writing Center of SNU. If you go on your SNU page and find the Writing Center, they have all the guidelines, and there's specific examples on how to cite if you have the author, if you have a website with no author, the date is missing. They have all the examples, and you can just go look at which example suits the source you have. Because I think the most obvious formatting for APA is we look at how you've, how you formatted references and sources. Randy is asking, I've been doing really well with my paper on Netflix, but I wish to add additional information to build my market share section more in depth. However, there's a lot of smaller companies which I cannot find reliable information on, and Amazon, which I couldn't find details of how many people watch their streaming since it's included in Prime. Do you have any tips for searching? Randy, actually, it's really hard. I've been researching Starbucks for days now, trying to find additional information, and I really struggled. Honestly, I would not worry about the much smaller companies that have a very small market share. I would focus on the ones that have a bigger market share because they will be more prominent on your Google research. One thing is read the commentary in the financial statements, because they might mention the competition and they might say something about losing or gaining market share to other competition. And usually I look at news articles. I look at the Washington Post, I look at Forbes. Those are the two that more often seem to focus on market share and market growth, and they have pie charts. So those are the two sources. The Economist doesn't usually have much on specific companies, and sometimes they do, but Forbes has a lot. So Forbes could be a place where you can search, and the Washington Post. I also recommend you going to the Shapiro Library. One of my students actually consulted the Shapiro librarian, so you can email them or contact them through the SNU website, and they can help you find information if it is available through the Shapiro Library. Yeah, Randy, sometimes you just need to focus on the bigger picture. Netflix has a lot of competition in smaller companies, because obviously there's the most prominent ones and then there's the small ones. I would focus on the ones that you find more information on, and I think you'll be fine. At the end of the day, what we're interested in seeing is that you were able to apply what you learned by studying microeconomics, right? So if you're able to give me some trends, I'm not going to go verify that that company actually has 5% of the market and then increase to 6%. What I'm really going to look at is that you were able to establish some trends and that the information makes sense. But it would be impossible to go verify that your source is 100% correct. So just find some sources that are valid sources, that would be credible sources, and you should be okay. We have Dana. My professor said I had no recommendation based on elasticity. I'm doing Starbucks and stuck on this. Dana, yes, when you provide a recommendation on the market trends, so you want to show how your firm can sustain the success going forward based on the demand trends you found. The demand trends are also going to be based on changes in prices and how the consumers reacted to it. So that's what you have to, basically, when you provide your recommendation, you have to, in Starbucks, most of the students have established that the demand is price inelastic, because Starbucks has increased its prices through the years gradually, and they don't seem to have lost market share because there's a lot of customer loyalty for them. So that is something you can explain, is because there's customer loyalty and the demand is price inelastic, Starbucks can, doesn't really have to worry about its pricing quite as much if the increases are minimal, if it needs to increase prices. You could write something like that, and that would include price elasticity. Dory, hi, I'm having a hard time finding barriers of entry for Sherwin-Williams. Any leads you may have for me? Sherwin-Williams would, for example, a barrier to entry could be branding. Other brands of paint can come in, but nobody knows what brand they are, and they might not purchase them. The other could be distribution, so reaching out to the consumer. New brands would have to negotiate sales through Home Depot, Lowe's, or other venues so that they can reach the consumers. So that could be a barrier to entry. So usually the competition can be a barrier to entry, the type of investments required to start producing the paints, if there's any regulations, what is the technology to produce paints, and what type of industry it is. If it's an oligopolistic industry, there in itself is a barrier most of the times, because the other firms are going to try and stop any new entrant. You're welcome. Talisha said, I also had trouble with elasticity. I'm researching Chipotle. So Chipotle is in the monopolistic competition, and I would imagine that there might be some level of elasticity to its product. That is, if Chipotle increases prices, there may be a decrease in demand. And I'm just sort of guessing here. I didn't do any research about it. So when you provide your recommendation, you need to explain how your recommendation can be applied considering the price elasticity of demand of the firm. And you need to use the data you found in the demand trends and supply trends to explain why you determine that type of price elasticity for Chipotle. David is saying, Dory, for paint, there is the EPA that regulates them, so maybe the regulation can be a barrier. Very good, David. Thank you very much. So we're overlapping into macroeconomic time. So we should be switching over. Yeah, Talisha, I know price elasticity can be tricky. But if you see that there's been changes in prices that have caused changes in consumers, in purchases and changes in demand, it doesn't matter if the price decreased and demand increased, that's still price elasticity. It doesn't have to be necessarily in reaction to a price increase. It can be in reaction to a price decrease. Like, for example, for Tesla, they brought out a cheaper car and their demand skyrocketed. So that's a good example. I'm going to switch over to macroeconomics. Thank you very much for attending micro. And participating with us tonight. You're welcome, Kenny. I'll, have everybody have a great holiday, because this was the last webinar for the semester. I'm glad you feel better, Randy. Thank you. Good night, Martin. So we're switching over to macroeconomics. I'm going to introduce myself again. I'm Chiara Yates. I'm just using Nicole's account to run the webinar. And my name is pronounced like a K. We're going to go over the final project. Hi, Dawn. We're going to go over the final project for macroeconomics. So what are the additional requirements for your PowerPoint that you need to add to your final project to be exemplary? First and foremost, I know this presentation doesn't show it, but you first and foremost have to develop the content in the speaker notes. If you don't have any content developed in the speaker notes, or your analysis is just one brief sentence, you will most likely only get a needs improvement. You won't even be proficient, because to be proficient, you have to have developed the content in the speaker notes. So let's, present this right away. And get it out of the way. You need to develop the speaker notes. The speaker notes are a little area below the slide where if you were presenting the slide, you would write notes for you to remember what to say. But because you're not presenting the slide in those speaker notes, you're actually explaining in detail what your slide means, what your research is. You're presenting your analysis in the speaker notes. Starting from the first slides, so in milestone 1, you research data. You research data on the GDP, unemployment and inflation, and on interest rates. To be exemplary, if you were proficient, you might have even been exemplary, or you might not. In most of these slides of the final, to be exemplary, you need to substantiate your content with resources. In particular, for milestone 1, you have to provide a more nuanced insight. What does that mean? It just means you need to go a little bit above what the rubric is asking, give a little bit more information regarding the GDP. So you would here, to be exemplary when you discuss GDP and growth, you want to also explain the relevance of the growth rate observed. Why is it important to observe those growth rates? Why did that happen at that time? What happened? So what the relevance of it is. So use your data. Use your historical, you have an overview of your decade that has the main historical or political happenings of your decade, and you can use that information briefly without going into too much detail, because you will have the opportunity later to just explain what were your growth trends for the decade. You also had to relate the GDP changes in output to the historical events that happened during your decade. And in here, you just want to give a good explanation of the relationship between the events that occurred and the changes in output that occurred as a consequence. So, for example, if you did Hurricane Katrina and you explained that Hurricane Katrina affected the GDP, you just want to give an additional explanation on how did it affect the GDP, what happened. Not just a generic Hurricane Katrina affected the GDP. No, explain it with a few more words to provide a nuanced insight into the relationship between what the event is and what the national output. You can use some principles that you've learned too from the book to support and substantiate basically why those events were important. Moving on, you research unemployment and inflation. So for unemployment and inflation, you will only be exemplary if you explain how the data is collected to calculate unemployment and inflation. The data to calculate unemployment is collected with a monthly survey. 20,000 households are called by people that work for the government, and they call these households and ask questions regarding who's employed, who's not employed, who gave up, who's a housemaker, who's military, who's student, ages, and they gather all this information, and through all this information, they're able to establish unemployment. And this is why unemployment is calculated monthly, so we know if it goes up and if it goes down. So that's the survey for unemployment. For inflation, it's the CPI. So they observe the changes in prices in the basket, in the goods that are contained in the basket of the CPI, and that's how we then get the values for inflation. So it's a little easier. So unemployment is a survey. If you do not explain that there's been a survey and that information is used to then calculate unemployment, you will not be able to be exemplary for that category. At the same time, you're also, here again, you are relating unemployment and inflation to the events that cause them to change. The events are likely the same that affected output and the GDP, because all these variables are connected. So you can use the same events, and you want to provide a more nuanced insight. Why some events might affect inflation more, some events might affect unemployment more. So you want to explain why those events specifically affected those factors. So you need to give a nuanced insight. Basically, you need to write a little more, be more specific about those elements. The last element of milestone 1 was the interest rates. So for the interest rates, you had to provide a chart that showed interest rate trends, and you had to explain how changes in interest rates can affect inflation, foreign trade rates, GDP, investment. So there was a very specific list on the rubric of these 4 elements. You provided information in the speaker notes. To be exemplary here, you want to go beyond these 4 elements and explain how interest rates might have affect other aspects of the economy. So for example, if interest rates affected investment and foreign trade rates, then you can also go a step forward and, well, foreign trade rates can affect import and export. And then so you can just relate those changes to the changes in our trade balance, to the changes in the exchange rates. And then you're going beyond the 4 elements that are listed in the rubric. For the final, you will be introducing new slides. The 2 new slides regard 2 of them are within the content. So foreign, where you're going to be examining foreign trade. Do not forget these slides. Forgetting whole elements in the final rubric is really gonna make it really hard to get even a D or a C, just because every element is important. So if you get a 0 on some elements, you will really struggle to get a higher grade. The foreign trade grades here in this presentation are introduced after interest rates. If it's easier for you to add them after milestone 3, you're free to do so. This just follows a better, flow. But you will be examining import and exports. You will need to provide a graphical representation of import and export. You need to use data, numbers, use those numbers in the speaker notes. You can look at them as a percentage of the GDP or just whole numbers. So when you analyze import and exports, relate them to other data from the economy, like exchange rates, for example. So a stronger dollar leads to more imports, right? Because if we have a stronger dollar, imports are cheaper for us to purchase, so we'll purchase more imports. As compared to a weaker dollar, that leads to more exports because our goods would be cheaper for other countries to purchase. So there's a link on this file that can help you research some more about import and exports, and you can find this file in the finals additional resources if you want to use these additional resources provided in the sample. The other element of foreign trade is models. Basically, you're doing the same thing you did with GDP, unemployment, and inflation, and determine events that impacted foreign trade. You can use economic models to explain them, but you basically want to determine what events would have impacted foreign trade for the US. So you can consider trade agreements that were important and they change. What are they based on? You can discuss comparative advantage to explain those trade agreements, which would be one of the models that relates to foreign trade. So really important, develop these two slides to use the models. You can use graphs, and you can find some really good graphs that illustrate trade in the PowerPoints provided by Hubbard that are available through my Econ Lab. If you go on my Econ Lab, you can go in the module resources and you can find videos and PowerPoints that are really helpful in reviewing materials, and they can be the PowerPoints can be really helpful in finding information to include in your presentation. That covers milestone 1, and it covers the additional slides you would have to include in the final. Moving to milestone 2. Milestone 2 and milestone 3 are the same, so we're going to go over them together pretty much, because they develop the content in the same way, right? The difference is in milestone 2, you examined fiscal policies. In milestone 3, you examined monetary policies. Fiscal policies are the policies enacted by the government. It's an act of Congress, and they are policies regarding government spending and taxation. If the policy regards regulation or anything else, and there's no changes in government spending and taxation, then it is not a fiscal policy. You can include it in your presentation if it has a relevance to something that you're explaining, but it does not cover the requirement of the rubric. So make sure you choose fiscal policies that, you know, are actual policies, are actual fiscal policies. In the first slide of fiscal policies, you examine the past. You examine policies from the past that impacted the beginning of your decade. To be exemplary in this category, you will have to cite scholarly resources to support the relation between the policies and the issues. So it's really important that you cite your sources and establish that relation between the policies and the issues that they resolved. You probably have sources and resources for everything you have researched and included in this presentation, but if you don't cite your source, then we cannot give you an exemplary. If you forget to cite it, you cannot get an exemplary in this category. So make sure you always cite your source, you reference it at the end, and you make the connection required by the rubric. The second element of the milestone was to establish the fiscal policy action of the actual decade you are researching. So you're not looking at the past anymore, you're looking at your present, your decade. In this case, again, you need to try and be exemplary. And again, in this section, you will cite qualified scholarly resources that provide specific examples for the fiscal policy actions enacted during your decade. So the first time you had, in the first slide, you had the scholarly resources to establish the connection between the policy and the issue. In this one, you have scholarly resources that provide a specific example. And this is required to be exemplary. And the last slide is the fiscal policy impact. So you've used the data that you have researched in milestone 1, you have related to the fiscal policy action and what their intent was, what they were trying to achieve. And by integrating and cross-referencing the data with the policy actions, you will be able to determine the impact of the policy. The other important element of this slide is to also explain how individuals and businesses were affected by the policies. So for example, if you have a policy that increases middle-class interest rates, how did the individual households get affected? Businesses might be affected less or more in the long term, but individuals would be affected right away, correct? So for this last action, you also have an exemplary category. And in this case, you are going to use concrete example and substantiate your claims. So when you're trying to explain what the impact of the policy was, you need to provide an example of why you think that was the impact of the policy, a concrete example. So I honestly, to provide a concrete example and substantiate your claims, you still need to cite a proper source where you found your example and your claim, you know, to substantiate your claim. So I would recommend that even though it's not a requirement here to cite scholarly sources, you would still cite your sources in addition to providing a concrete example, just because the two things really go hand in hand. If we go over monetary policies, the requirements are exactly the same. For the first slide, which is the slide where you frame the decade, looking at the policies from the past, again, you have to cite scholarly sources to support the relationship between the policies and the issues. Why were those policies enacted? What issues were they trying to resolve? Use a scholarly source that explains that relation, that you can, you know, use to explain that relation. In the second slide, you're examining the monetary policies of your decade. Again, here, you need to cite scholarly sources, but to provide specific examples of the monetary policies, the intent they tried to achieve. Now remember, what are monetary policies? Policies that are only enacted by the Federal Reserve and they're that uses the policy tools which are open market operations, change in reserve, and change in discount rate. Any policy that does not include one of these three tools is not a monetary policy. Don is saying, this was the milestone when I ran into trouble. I could not find monetary policies that were done later in the 1980s. You probably couldn't find prominent fiscal monetary policies in the late 1980s, but go look and see what changes there were in the interest rates. And if the interest rates even went up half a point, down half a point in the late 1980s, that is a monetary policy, a very valid one. And that is what you need to do. You know, that is what you would explain. That in the late 80s, there was changes in interest rates. Usually the changes in interest rates occur all the time. I mean, they might skip a year, but it's not going to skip, you know, they're going to do something just because monetary policies help. Changes in interest rate help control the market. You're welcome, Don. Yeah, sometimes it seems irrelevant, a change in interest rates, but this is what's happening right now, right? You hear in the news all the time that the Federal Reserve is going to increase rates 2 more times, for example, by the summer, I think. What does that mean? Why is it increasing these interest rates? It is increasing interest rates because interest rates were almost at 0 due to the recession, and now it's gradually increasing them as the market picks up, because you still want to have a controlled economic growth. You don't want the economy to boom too fast, too quick, and then our country cannot support it. Our economy cannot support that growth. And so by increasing the interest rates, it kind of gives it a control. Now, there's some economists that believe interest rates shouldn't be raised yet because the economy is not ready for it, and they may be right. You know, and really sometimes we only find out through trial and error. We just, you know, the people running the Federal Reserve are economists, they're expert, and we just have to hope sometimes that they're correct and that they're increasing the interest rates will not slow down the economy. And then if they notice after the first increase that it may slow down the economy, they might not have a second increase and they'll stop. So going back to the monetary policies, as I said, it's a monetary policy only if it involves a change in interest rates or a discount rate. Open market operations, so buying and selling bonds on the market to increase the money supply, and the reserve, changing the reserve requirements, which has not happened in the last couple of decades. It's very rare that they will change the reserve requirements. If it's one of these 3 policy tools, then it is a monetary policy, and monetary policies are used to pursue high employment, economic growth, financial market stability, and price stability, which is part of the reasons why the Federal Reserve today is still thinking of increasing interest rates. Again, here, for the monetary policies, you will have to cite scholarly sources, as I said, to provide specific examples. Moving on to the third and last slide of milestone 3, you would have to describe the impact of the policies. Again, you need to describe what the impact of the policies was for individuals and businesses also. That is really important. And again, use the data you found in milestone 1 and cross-reference that data to the monetary policies and what happened after. Did GDP go up or down? Did unemployment increase or decrease as a consequence right after the monetary policies? And then you'll be able to determine or measure an impact for the policies. Again, here in this last one, you will have to substantiate your claims. So you have to provide a concrete example. You can provide concrete examples of the impact of individual households and businesses. If you have a concrete example, and if it's not a personal experience you're providing, you will most likely have a source you found it on, and make sure you cite that source. To complete the final, you have to also provide 2 conclusion slides, and 2 conclusion slides. I know some students tend to ask me if they can have 1, and you might be able to have 1 if you are able to include the whole 2 elements of the rubric, but I think using only 1 slide is a little too much information in 1 slide only, because the first slide of the conclusion is literally a summary of the decade. You provided an overview at the beginning, and you can provide something similar, but in this case, you are integrating the data you found, you're analyzing some of the policies. You're not providing here an opinion yet. You're just providing an analysis and a summary of the policies and how the decade went. So you summarize it. It's a history, an economic story of the decade, and you need to make the connections. Make the connections between the history, the policies, and the data, as a summary. You might not be able to include all this information in the slide, so I still recommend developing it in the speaker notes. Some instructors are stricter about speaker notes than others, so make sure you always develop the speaker notes. In the second conclusion slide, yes, Candace, always cite your resources. Honestly, regardless of whether it is a requirement for the exemplary or not, always cite your sources, because that substantiates your claims. It tells your instructor that what you found is legitimate, even if they disagree with it, but you found it and it's a reliable source, and so you're going to use it. The last slide of the final will be an agree-disagree. So here you've examined all these fiscal and monetary policies. You were able to analyze the outcomes. Were they successful? Were they not successful? You've explained the intent of the policy, but doesn't mean that that intent was then achieved. So when you explain the impact, you might have found out that the policy was not as successful as intended, or it was even more successful than intended. So here's your opportunity to provide an opinion on your decade. Do you think that the policies enacted were suitable, that the actions were suitable to the issues that they were tackling? And to substantiate your opinion, you need to use sources. And Candace, here too, you need to make sure you cite your sources, because that is the only way you can substantiate it. Now, your source does not have to be researched on some, difficult website. It can simply be Hubbard, because you might be applying economic principles to agree and disagree. Actually, if you do apply the economic principles and models that you've learned through the course, you will be really showing that you mastered economics, applying the principles to the final and the information you found, and that will really seal the deal. So in these two slides, you're already going for the exemplary. You didn't have a slide that was just proficient, so you will just be following the rubric for the final. And so for the first one, trends and outcomes, for the summary, you will provide specific examples that demonstrate the trends and the outcomes. And for the agreement and disagreement, you will have a well-supported and plausible opinion. Well-supported means that you have sources to back it up. And this concludes the final. The only other slide that you would include is the references slide. That would have to be an APA style. And as you can see, if you go find this document, you'll be able to click on the APA style and get information. The other place where you can find information on APA style is in the Writing Center. They have documents that provide you examples on how to cite and reference in APA, with examples on how to do it if you have an author, if you don't have the name of the author and you just have a name of a website. It just provides you the different examples so that you can get it right. Don't necessarily rely, well, you're using PowerPoint, which doesn't have APA formatting in it, so you should be doing it manually, including your formatting and your citations. And that is all for the final. If you have any questions regarding what we went over, we have a few minutes and I can answer them. Oh, you're welcome, Dawn. I'm glad I could be useful. Oh, Candace, yes. You would put your references in alphabetical order. That only makes sense because when just imagine you're the reader and you find your citation, and it's a citation that starts with a W, say, the last name of the author is a W name, then I would go read, and I know that I might find it towards the end of my reference list because W is one of the last letters of the alphabet, right? Well, if they were all in different alphabetical order, it would just make it more burdensome to go find the correct reference. The reason you're providing the reference list is because you cited your sources in the content, and the reader might want to go verify your source, might want to read more upon it, right? Might be curious. And, you know, I know for you guys, the readers, your instructor who probably already knows all the sources and has read tons of presentations and knows everything about the 1980s. However, you always must assume that the reader might be another student or someone who's not well versed on the 1980s or a new decade, and they might want to read upon more. And that is what the references list does. Every time you read an academic publication, you can go into the references and go look it up, you know, go learn more about that topic. So they're really useful. And the other reason for them is to prevent plagiarism. If you're using someone else's ideas, you know, you need to give them credit for it. But Candace, good job on the alphabetical order. I do not always check the alphabetical order, I will be honest. Some instructors are more strict than others on the APA style. I check for the formatting of the actual reference that it is correct, and I check that your references are cited. So I will actually count all the references and make sure that there's at least that same number of different authors cited within, and that the citations are correct and consistent. You know, citing one time at the beginning of the sentence, you do one sentence, then you cite, and then you continue using the same source, but you don't cite it again. That is incorrect. You need to recite, cite again every time you continue using that source, for example. So make sure you cite often and consistently throughout your content. Are there any more questions? I see someone might be typing, so I'll give it a few more minutes. And then, what about 2 or 3 sentences and then cite after them? 2 or 3 sentences is acceptable as long as you cite at the end of the last sentence. Yes. Like at the end of the paragraph, it's okay. I've had students who cite at the second sentence, but then the third, the fourth, and the fifth sentence are still referring to that citation, and they don't cite again. And that is incorrect because you're still using the same source, right? But if you cite at the end of the paragraph, sometimes it's, you know, if it's not an extremely long paragraph. If you're quoting, absolutely include your quotation marks and cite at the very end. It's not enough to say that I read on the Washington Post and then quote it and then not cite at the end. You still have to cite it in the end, even if you've mentioned the Washington Post at the beginning. That is really important too. Marlene, it looks like you've logged in a couple of times. Unless you have other students that have your same name. Oh, okay. Oh, I'm glad you actually managed to hear then. I'm glad you're here. If you have a question, I'll give you another few minutes for questions. Otherwise, we can wrap up the evening. This is the last webinar for this semester. Oh, you're welcome, Marlene. I hope you have all a great holidays. There's a 2-week break, so you can rest up for the new semester. Oh, Candace, I'm very glad the webinars are helpful. There's going to be changes the next semester. They're going to be live, but they're not going to be recorded anymore. So only students in attendance will be able to follow the webinar. Oh, Randy, you're welcome. Well, it's good to follow some of the webinars, and then you know, you're ahead of the game when you get to macro. When you get to macro, always read up on the content of the webinars before you participate. This way you really can ask questions because you know what to ask. Yeah. And I find macroeconomics, I like it. It just because it concerns aspects of the economy that interest me more and I can relate to more closely since I don't own a business and I don't deal with businesses that much. So I find that pretty interesting. Well, I'm going to wrap up this